questions people might have. I'll try to figure out how to, there we go. Oh, I'm just now seeing the chat. I had it hidden while I was, let me work through some of that. Yeah, 18th century Proud Boy, yeah, really.
Can I ask, is there anything in particular about the English printing of his books, because he was a printer himself, that marks them as exceptional physical objects? I mean, was there some special refinement or something attached to them by the the actual production of the book?
So it's difficult to answer, but I would say that one thing is Richardson was always revising, always adding new, what we would say, content to his novels. So Clarissa is a great example. The third edition is called the Letters Restored edition, and it added probably what we would say 200 pages of new content throughout. And Richardson rubricated in the third edition all of the sections that had new or altered material and had footnotes relating you to those pages in the first and second editions, trying to get people to compare and study it. He also had all of these paratextual editions that would discuss like how the novels were supposed to be read. He would answer like fan mail, essentially like people who'd written about novels or like how they thought it should end or what they thought about it. He'd like respond to them, and he would publish all of these in later editions of the novel. So there's a sense that there's not anything, I guess, particularly English about the presentation of his novels, like in this kind of London print culture environment, but he was very controlling about how he wanted them to be read and how people would see them. And his insistence on kind of controlling the print apparatus of his novels is what's seen as being a really fundamental moment for the sophistication of the novel genre in the 18th century, because in the 1740s, which is when Pamela comes out, it's still a sort of weird genre. Like they're not thinking of it the same way that we would think of novels today. Like novels are kind of seen more as soap operas to them in some way, and that they're these kind of dramatic, controversial things that sometimes teach bad morals because they've got like prostitutes and robbers and thieves and pirates, and they're really sensational, and that they're not really these kinds of sophisticated, literature with a capital L. And what Richardson's doing is really trying to change that. He moralizes through them, and he tries to elevate it to this high standard of literature. And all of these poetic receptions and panegyrics of his work relate that the English audiences like actually kind of bought into that. And even contemporary scholars back when in the early 20th century, when 18th century literature was kind of being brought more into the canon, I mean, so many of them trace Richardson as kind of like the birth of the English novel. And then slightly later people worked it back to Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe, and newer scholarship is like working it even further back into the Restoration period and looking at works by authors like Afraben and Della Revere Manley. So we're kind of expanding our notions of what the novel is now. But I mean, even for scholars in the early 20th century, it was like what Richardson was doing was so fundamentally different from other authors at the time period that his novels just really had a much more sophisticated print presence through all of his paratextual editions, but also just kind of how he was conceiving of the novel genre itself is this really sort of powerful tool.
But he's a very different creature than like Lawrence Sterne, because Sterne's Tristram Shandy is so overwhelmingly modern in its approach, the structure of the actual book, with its weird pages, and its funny diagrams of plot and things like that. But Richardson is all about trying to control people's reception of the content. Do I understand this right?
Yeah, they're in some ways, I mean, it's kind of funny because the two people that always get pitted against each other are Richardson and Henry Fielding. And the reason for that is the two were very publicly oppositional. So they would like respond to each other. So Sir Charles Grandison is actually kind of Richardson's response to Fielding's Tom Jones. And so the two would kind of fight with each other, and Fielding was very he was sophisticating the older episodic kind of European romance in the broader sense of the term, and Richardson was trying to do something different. And a lot of people read what Richardson's trying to do is like the more English approach. Like Fielding is doing, so he's kind of reinterpreting this older European style of novel writing, like from Cervantes, Don Quixote. I mean, Tom Jones is sort of a reworking of that, and Richardson's trying to go in a completely opposite direction. But Sterne is kind of in the same period in the mid-century doing something completely different with Tristram Shandy. And part of what Sterne's responding to is that novels had become much more standardized in their kind of textual and graphic apparatus throughout the century. And Richardson's, I guess, kind of seen as the culmination of the prehistory of the novel by these scholars. And so that's why they start with him as like the scholar of the modern novel.
Thank you so much for your talk, Dylan. I really enjoyed it. I'm kind of biased because I get to hear a lot of your really wonderful ideas and being friends with you and having been in a program with you, but I'm excited to hear kind of this new version of what you're working on with Sir Charles Grandison. I was interested in what you were showing with the kind of German representation of Englishness for a German audience in those images that are included in the German edition. Is there something akin to that in the English editions, or is the inclusion of kind of the figures and the kind of visual apparatuses specific to German and other foreign language editions?
Yeah, so there were engravings done for all three of Richardson's novels. I don't think any of the first editions had engravings. And one reason for that was they were so lengthy that the printing process was already kind of so labor intensive just to get them out that I don't think that he had engravings for any of the first editions. But there were engravings for later editions of all three of them. And they were done by various people. I'm actually not sure how involved in that process Richardson was. I do know that some of the works that were done for Clarissa, partially in engravings, but there were also some portraits made by Joseph Highmore. And Richardson had a really great relationship with him because Richardson has also sat for portraiture with Highmore. So I think he like kind of trusted him and knew that he would represent his novels appropriately in this kind of more illustrative graphic medium. I'm not sure about the entire history of like the English engravings to Grandison, but I do know that the German ones by Bernegerot that I had shown, they were a completely new series of 21 engravings. So they weren't based on the English engravings that had been done to prior editions. They were basically like new. There was a new fancier edition that was going to come out in the 60s. And so they wanted to have engravings in it so they could drive up the price. And that's when Reich went to London to meet with Richardson to get his advice on what the engraving should look like. And then of course, Richardson had all of these suggestions for like actual people that the character should be based off of course, all English people. And to my knowledge, they went with his suggestions for the figures, and those are the figures that we have in the German illustrations. And I'm really upset because I was going to go to a talk at one of our national 18th century conferences that was scheduled for April and then was rescheduled because of COVID. It was going to be in Toronto, hopefully this spring, and now that's been moved online because going to Toronto even this spring is looking like an impossibility. But one of my colleagues, Terry Dirksen, is currently writing a book on kind of 18th century celebrities, especially as they're interpreted in these kind of like literary and graphic mediums. And she has a whole chapter on Grandison illustrations, especially in Dutch, French, German, and English editions. And I was so excited to hear her talk, and now I don't know when I'm going to hear her speak on this. I can't wait until her book comes out so I can finally read what she has to say about the engravings, because there's this kind of renewed scholarly interest in them, I guess.
Dylan, why not contact her, email her, and see if she can share the talk?
Yes, I've been in contact with her because I actually had a PDF of one of the German copies of the engravings, and there were a couple of them that she hadn't found elsewhere doing her own research, so I was able to share some with her. I think because it's part of her book chapter that she might not be so willing to like relinquish a copy. But I also haven't asked. I'm sure she wouldn't have an issue if I did ask to see it. But yeah, maybe I'll contact her soon because it's really been on my mind.
Well, and I think Deborah has a question.
Yes, thanks.
Oh, yes.
So I dropped a couple of questions into chat, but it seems like people are asking questions out loud. So I will transfer over. Thanks so much for that fascinating talk. So I have a couple of questions. One is that the title page that you showed of the history of Sir Charles Grandison, 1754, there was apparently a later bookseller added at the very tail of that title page. And in fact, I checked on Echo, 18th Century Collections online to see that the image there doesn't have that additional bookseller. So I was just wondering if you could say anything about the publication or the printing, the publishing or distribution of that edition. And the second question really quick is, what typeface are you using in your slides?
Yeah, so I have a, wait, am I still on mute? Okay, I'm unmuted. So I have it's like a custom downloaded font. It's like a fell based one. It's kind of like a loosely based on like late 17th century, early 18th century typeface. I can put the name in the chat. I just downloaded it online. It's really nice because I don't find it too difficult to read, even though it's meant to look older, but it kind of sets the mood. As for the so the booksellers for Richardson's work, there were a couple main ones. So the Rivington family were kind of the main booksellers who were involved with Richardson's novels. And actually, of course, I'm forgetting the first name, if it was Henry or Charles.
Charles.
Yeah, so he was actually the one that kind of got Richardson into novel writing to begin with, because before Richardson wrote Pamela, he was working on a collection of letter writing manuals. And it was common in this period to kind of narrativize the letter writing manual, so they weren't these kind of like how to write a letter for dummies. They kind of had a thematic approach to them, like, oh, you're going to a party and like this is the situation, and like the entire book would kind of follow the same characters and the same premise to show people like this is how you should write letters. And Richardson wrote several of these that were quite lengthy. And one of them started, he kind of imagined this story of a maid who has to ward off the sexual advances of her employer while she's working at his estate. And he'd shared these ideas with Rivington, and Rivington said, oh, well, you should turn that into an epistolary novel because people would want to read that and it would give you an opportunity to moralize. And that's where Pamela came from. It was originally just intended to be part of Richardson's letter writing series. But the additional booksellers, it's kind of sort of complicated. And I've been focusing so much more on the German situation that now I'm getting rustier with the actual English situation. But because he was so popular, there were a number of people that were selling him. So the Rivingtons weren't the only one. You could get his works from quite a few different booksellers, but I'm not aware of what the exact financial arrangement between all of them were at the time. I haven't really read up a whole lot on that. And what I did know about the Rivington situation in the past, I can't recall without my notes on it at this moment. But I mean, to speak to the popularity of his works, Pamela, which was his first novel, so when he wasn't really known for being a novelist, kind of sparked this crazy literary culture akin to like what we would think of like the Harry Potter novels or 50 Shades of Grey. It was like the thing that everyone was reading and everyone had an opinion of it. Even they either hated it or they loved it or somewhere in between, but everyone was talking about it. Everyone was buying a copy. And it also launched like this sort of merchandise subculture, which is really popular for TV, movies, and books now, to like have all of these objects that pair with the book. I mean, people wanted, you know, oh, this was Pamela's teacup, and this was Pamela's fan, and this was her quill. And I mean, it had this really vibrant merchandise culture, which again, for novels in the 18th century, the culture didn't really see them that way yet. And Pamela was the first time that they were really engaging with it in that way. So, I mean, it was wildly popular. And so by the time he gets to Grandison, his third novel after the huge success of Clarissa, I imagine that there were a lot of people who wanted in on the financial dealings with selling his novel. And yeah, I don't know the specifics of those arrangements.
Thank you.
I should look more into it.
If I can just make a quick addendum. So I work at the Folger Shakespeare Library, and we have a large collection of these objects, like ceramic objects relating to 18th century merchandising of Shakespeare, but more particularly of particular actors. You know, and so what you just said reminded me of that. So you can have these ceramic of, you know, David Garrick as a certain character, for example. So it interestingly just ties in with that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and it's like, it's really kind of a testament to Richardson's project of the novel, because people associated that kind of culture with, you know, capital L literature, Shakespeare, right? Like that was appropriate to put on porcelain because it was such a like kind of cultural object, right? Like the manifestation of the literariness in the material. And the fact that people were doing that with his novels was like really what he was trying to do. Like he really wanted to elevate novel writing to this same level of like, it's Shakespeare, but it's prose, and it's also 900 pages long.
Dylan, thank you very much for this presentation. Fascinating, walk through this whole period. I'm really interested in Richardson as a printer, and so he was the publisher of his own work. And did he? There's a lot of questions that come up with that. He had editor. Did he have people who would read and edit, and the typical things that the publisher would do to sort of correct the text or suggest to the text? And also, how did he keep up with demand? Did he farm it out? Did other people get rights to publish and print, or did he keep control of that whole process? And did these books ever go out of print as a result of needing to be in control of that printing? You mentioned the 2,500 copies in the German edition, and what was a typical English press run for this, and how did the whole production side get managed as the demand grew? A lot of questions.
Yeah. So to speak to the situation of Richardson and demand, he'd been running a print shop before he became a novelist. That was kind of his career. He apprenticed as a printer and then took over. And so when he's writing Pamela, he's already in his 50s. So he's pretty well established as a printer, and he'd been printing all sorts of things. I mean, he'd printed several of Daniel Defoe's things. So there's also the Defoe-Richardson connection, even though it's quite a bit later. And he was also in charge of printing his letter writing manuals, and he had a huge staff. I'm not sure if I've ever seen like an exact estimate of how many workers he had. But the sheer length of these novels, I mean, he had a pretty successful print operation going, and had a fairly large group of employees. As for editing, he was mostly in charge of that himself. And there was an interesting study that was started, I think it's probably been closer to 10, 15 years, maybe even longer now. There are actually anthropologists that have been examining his skeleton to determine the physical strain on his body of being so involved in his work, because he was really just kind of like the dawn till dusk kind of work. I mean, he was always in his print shop doing things, and then he would come home and he would write his novels by candlelight, after the sun was down. Once they were out and they were published, he was constantly revising, constantly adding new material, and that was all from him. He didn't have like an editorial team that was going through and fixing things or like adding new material. It was just him literally rewriting his novels. One reason for that was especially with Pamela, I mean, Pamela came out, and a lot of the people who had an issue with it saw it as being like pornography in disguise. And he really hated that, because he was trying to do the exact opposite. He was trying to show the story of a virtuous woman who, even after all of this temptation is thrown at her, doesn't give in to it and ends up reforming him. There are a lot of problematic things about that construction, especially today, but he was really trying to represent virtue, and a lot of his critics said, like, no, it's pornographic, and they thought that he was, really actually trying to write a 50 Shades of Grey, but was disguising it as virtuous. So all of his Pamela rewrites were to like tell people, like, no, it's virtuous. He would rewrite things to make Pamela look more virtuous and to try to edit some of the sex out. In Clarissa, a number of readers kind of fell in love with the villain, Robert Lovelace. He's very seductive and convincing. You see how he's able to kind of steal Clarissa away, but unfortunately he had that kind of effect on people. I don't know if you remember in like 2013 where everyone fell in love with that, the guy who went to jail, and they like posted his mugshot, and then he became like a model and like a celebrity because everyone fell in love with him, even though he was kind of this criminal. Like, that happened with Lovelace, and then Richardson was so upset that people were falling in love with Lovelace because he was supposed to be the villain, so he'd like add footnotes in later editions saying don't fall for him, he's villainous, as you will see later, like trying to control how people would read. He published kind of like what we would say are spark notes to his own novels. Like, he published reading guides that would like tell you how you were supposed to read and interpret all of the scenes. They'd have biblical passages associated. So all of that's to say that there was this huge amount of stuff coming out, and it was all sort of at his behest. He was in charge of writing all of it. He did all of the editing and the revising. He had a pretty large group of employees who kept up with this. Like I said, I'm not sure how many, but his novels never went out of print in the 18th century. They saw sometimes up to 8 different editions just during his lifetime, which again, he started writing when he was 50. So, it's not like he was around that much longer after he became a novelist. He died in the 70s, I believe.
And just from a technical point of view, all this, these weren't novels that were in standing type in galleys. In other words, these novels are so big that there'd have to be an army of compositors, and every time he's revising it, it's probably all entirely reset, right? In other words, there are no files of the type. He has to set it and probably be distributing that type while he's doing the last chapters. All the first chapters have disappeared.
Especially like the 3rd edition of Clarissa, the letters restored. It was an absolutely insane amount of material that was added to that thing, and it really wasn't that long after the publication of the 1st and 2nd edition. So even if somehow he'd had the longest continual novel in the English language sitting on galley trays, the amount of work for reinserting all of this new material, which was sometimes in the middle of a letter that already existed. It wasn't like he just stuck a bunch of new letters in. He was like constantly reworking the inner structure of the pre-existing letters. So it was really a kind of crazy amount of labor that went into it. And you'll see even in the 19th century, there's still tons and tons of new Richardson editions coming out, especially in this new style of printing where they do kind of like Reader's Digest, where they had like little excerpts from tons of different things, and it'd be this huge 1,000-page bound volume that had just 200 pages here and there of different novels, which was possible to changes in how copyright worked. And Richardson was featured in almost every single one of these things that had an 18th century offering. So he really kind of never went out of print in the 18th and 19th centuries. And now, ironically enough, Sir Charles Grandison is largely out of print. We only have access to a print-on-demand version that comes from Jocelyn Harris, who's the editor of, it was originally done for Oxford in the 80s, I think 84. And then she got the permission to do her own kind of reprint of it through a New Zealand printer, and she lives in New Zealand, and now you can order that, but it's like $90 or something like that. And used copies of Sir Charles Grandison, either the Oxford World Classics paperback or the New Zealand publication that she's doing, $100 easily on Amazon or something. So now we're having kind of an issue of Grandison being out of print, but in the 18th and 19th centuries, it definitely wasn't.
Any others about the talk specifically?
Sorry, I was trying to figure out how to unmute myself there. Dylan, I was wondering, you'd mentioned that there was a pirated edition of one of these that came out, but before the London edition. Is that what you were saying? And I'm wondering what was the process in there? Was there a serial publication that was compiled into a single volume by them? What did that look like?
So yeah, there was a Dublin issue that came out. It was the same year, but a few months before it was set to come out in London. And basically, I forget the exact printer and bookseller in Dublin, because their name isn't obviously on the title page, so it always slips my memory. But they bribed Richardson's staff into leaking them copies of the novel. And then they very quick, I mean, I don't even know how quickly they had to have done this, but they put together their own copy of it and then released it in Dublin, like I said, months before the London edition was set to come out. So its first publication was actually the Dublin imprint of the pirated edition. And Richardson, I mean, because it hadn't come out in London yet, he was able to draft a statement to the Dublin pirates on the piracy of his novel. And it was circulated as an individual pamphlet, but he also attached it to the first edition of his novel. And in that, he kind of, I mean, he uses, it's really sort of interesting if you're going along this sort of Richardson as an English colonist instead of this like pan British figure, because the way that he's referring to the Dublin piracy of his novel is like this Irish theft of English property. So like the theft of like the colonial subjects of something that belongs to England. He uses a lot of language that suggests that kind of reading, and he was really upset by this. And so the worker, I think he found out who it was and they were fired. But yeah, it wasn't serialized. He just the people in Dublin managed to get a copy of it from copies that were already printed before it was ready to be distributed, and worked with an alarming amount of speed to get their own edition out.
That's impressive. Thanks. I actually, during your talk, I did find that response of his. I didn't read it, so now thank you for saving that. I'm going to send that link to everyone. But thank you, Dylan. Really great talk.
Well, I'll echo that. Thank you, Dylan. That's a wonderful talk. And we are just, you have really stepped up. What pandemic? I mean, you've done a great job. These presentations are always a surprise, and they're so much fun. We've enjoyed these presentations ever since we started doing these a few years ago. I'm really sorry that we aren't all together in the Rosenwald room, but on the other hand, this is more people than we've ever had for one of these presentations, and we will get you into the Rosenwald room eventually. So
cool. I'll have a fun new thing to talk about. Like I said, I've been collecting lots of different 18th century editions of Richardson's work, and so maybe I'll also do a kind of show and tell and bring all of my I've been trying to really create kind of like a timeline. I've got different editions from different countries. I've got French, German, Spanish, English, American. So I'd love to do something with that and be able to take advantage of an in-person setting and bring some things that people can look at and touch and pass around.
Great. And as a side note, you and I need to talk about printing history, because
yes.
We're open to receive at printing history. So yeah, we'll talk about that. I'm going to turn off the recording now.